While I love the X-Men, and of course you all know this I imagine, I cannot deny that they were predated by DC's own Doom Patrol. In fact, one of the creators of Doom Patrol, Arnold Drake, even confessed later in his life that he did in fact think that Marvel could have stolen the idea for their X-Men from DC, directly being inspired by what DC was planning to do with Doom Patrol. While earlier on in his life, Drake was initially a little bit more dismissive of the idea that Jack Kirby and Stan Lee over at Marvel had been inspired by Doom Patrol due to the fact that X-Men came out, only a few months after. He later reflected and changed his tune. This was because at the time, the Marvel method was in full swing, which actually made it easier and faster for Marvel to churn out comics. The Marvel method has been considered controversial to say the least, among many working in the industry and among fans, as people wonder about the true balance in the collaboration between artists and writers who use that method. The Marvel method involves a writer coming up with a story summary, pitching it to their artist, who then takes the summary and then creates the visuals of the comic, drawing it as they imagine the story to unfold without a specific panel-by-panel script as their guide. They leave notes for the writer and then pass back their work to the writer, who basically finishes the comic by filling in the dialogue. In some cases, we even now know that writers' dialogue was taken almost directly from artists' notes as well. However, no matter how controversial it is today, the Marvel method made the process of creating comics faster, and this in addition to the fact that many writers and artists went back and forth between the big two publishers of DC and Marvel back in the day, and still do now to be honest, made Arnold Drake wary that someone actually could have shared the idea of Doom Patrol that they'd perhaps overheard at DC to Stan Lee over at Marvel. With the Marvel method in full swing, the comic could then have been easily made quickly enough to be released just shortly after Doom Patrol's release itself. At least, that's the theory. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd, if you love these cool sleeves that I'm wearing today, be sure to let us know you love us by clicking that subscribe. I mean, you don't want to miss when we all wear cool sleeves, Number 9. Norman Osborn / Green Goblin. Norman Osborn is one of my favorite villains in all of Marvel Comics, but is he completely original? While there isn't one specific DC character that is quite like him, I would say, there might be two that could be combined together and in doing so have inspired his creation. That is both Lex Luthor, who bears some resemblance in terms of his characterization to Norman, and the Joker, who bears some resemblance to Norman's Green Goblin persona. While Lex and the Joker both made their first appearances back in the 1940s over at DC Comics, Green Goblin, like Spider-Man, the superhero he is most often attached to, would not appear until the 1960s. Number 8. Sentry. I mean, I think you know where I'm going with this one. Sentry is basically a ripoff of Superman. But that being said, Robert Reynolds is also unique in the sense that he provides a sort of fresh take on this characterization. While Superman is all-powerful, an alien from another world that he was too young to really ever know, Bob is a human, just a straight-up human, who initially thought he was chosen for a specific soldier serum type program to become a hero. In reality though, he was a man with many personal demons who ended up breaking into a laboratory late one night, hoping to find something, and ended up taking the Golden Sentry serum, which granted him the power of 1 million suns. Sentry, however, has a darker half that came with him, a supervillain known as the Void, and so for years, humanity and Bob himself was made to basically forget that he ever existed. That's how you know you are powerful enough to be on Soup's level, when being retconned because the danger you pose is actually written into your own story. Number 7. Ant-Man. Ant-Man technically is a copy of DC's Atom. At least, that's how he started out anyways, and that's how some people see it. Over the years, Ant-Man has grown though a lot as a character, and I mean a lot. Well, and I mean, now he's gone, so rest in peace, Hank. And while Ray Palmer and Hank Pym may have started out as similar in terms of their abilities, their journeys, I would say, have been very different. I could get into all of it, but honestly, I mean, that could be a whole list all its own because they both have some really cool histories. So I'll just leave it with this. Atom came out during a time when comics were desperate to once more hold the attention of readers, and science at that time was all the rage. Both were inspired by the field of science because of this, belonging to a whole era of basically science-based heroes and villains. Atom could shrink and so could Ant-Man, but they both use their powers somewhat differently. Both were members members of premier superhero teams, with Ant-Man being a founding member of the Avengers and Atom joining the Justice League, but both also had different approaches to what their roles were on said teams. Number 6. Black Cat. Black Cat. I wonder who she was inspired by. Many for years have called Felicia Hardy a ripoff of Catwoman, and I mean, you look at them together, I get it. It makes sense when you look at the comic book history, with Catwoman appearing decades earlier and both sharing multiple similarities. Namely that they are both romantic interests of masked vigilantes who also have a criminal history. Felicia herself is a cat burglar who dresses up in a cat suit and has a cat themed name. She even sometimes has claws. Catwoman is also a cat burglar known for her skills as a thief and her dexterous abilities. She too dresses up in a cat inspired outfit during her capers, I would say even a little bit more so. Both have also acted as thieves and villains, but also played the role of hero and anti-hero, teaming up with their own lovers who tend to be heroes themselves, Batman and Spider-Man. And both are iconic characters, staples each in their own self-contained universes. However, despite all these similarities, Marv Wolfman, who created Felicia Hardy, did claim that he was actually inspired not by a comic book character from the 1940s, not by Catwoman, but instead a cartoon cat character from the 1940s known simply as Black Cat, a straight up cat, who caused those around them to experience bad luck simply with their presence. The cat in question is from the 1949 cartoon Bad Luck Blackie, and the cat's power set, I will say, does line up with one Felicia eventually was confirmed to have. However, I would still say that Catwoman does seem to, at least at this point, if not right from the beginning, have influenced Black Cat's evolution over the years. I mean, I don't think we can deny that. I understand what people are saying, and I want to trust creators of characters, but I think now, maybe, there might have been some influence. Perhaps. Number 5. Eternals. New Gods and Eternals is a comparison that is as old as time. As old as the gods, some might say. Why does this exist? Why do we compare these two? Well, this is because the Eternals came after the New Gods, and they are both, god-based groups who are known for their sheer power. But more importantly, it's because they share a creator who definitely was inspired by his own creations, including the New Gods when he created the Eternals, and their mythos for Marvel. That creator is none other than the legendary Jack Kirby. The story of the Eternals creation is pretty interesting too. It was basically Jack Kirby's way of continuing his story with a new creation. You see, he wrote New Gods for DC, but when he couldn't get enough creative control from that publisher, ultimately left to go back to Marvel, creating for them his and their Eternals. Number 4. Hyperion. If you thought Sentry seemed to be heavily inspired by DC Superman, wait until you meet Hyperion. Hyperion is literally a straight up Superman copy. Hyperion is actually an alien from another world and in the Marvel universe, also generally from another universe entirely. Like Superman, he also arrived on Earth when he was only a baby, also hailing from a world that had recently been completely destroyed, making him the last known survivor. Also like Superman, he is insanely strong, can survive in the vacuum of space, is also insanely fast, durable, has a healing factor, super hearing, and even atomic vision. Now, atomic vision is basically heat vision, so. Also, Hyperion was basically made to be, a bit of a commentary on Superman, so obviously he's inspired by him. Number 3. Deadpool. Deadpool is actually one of my favorite Marvel characters, but even I can admit that he is a direct ripoff of DC's Deathstroke. Although, I will add, the thing I really love about Wade Wilson is that he is a straight up parody of Slade Wilson, so at least he provides some interesting commentary as opposed to just being like a direct one-for-one copy. Where Slade is often shown as being extremely serious and one of the most deadly assassins in the world, Wade is often shown as being pretty ridiculous, and while skilled, is not actually known as much for his abilities as an assassin, but is more deadly thanks to his relentless healing factor and often thanks to some good old dumb luck. And I mean, both these guys also share healing factors, so yeah. And if you don't think, if you're like, how dare you say that about Deadpool, he is so insanely skilled, I mean, friends. We all saw what happened when Deadpool was cured of his healing factor and made handsome again and quite mortal again, and he was super rusty when it came to his skills after becoming reliant on his powers for years. His lack of familiarity with dodging damage was shown to have made him kinda sloppy as a mercenary, to be honest with you. I don't think that makes him a bad character. It's not a diss, it's just a fact. Number 2. Power Princess. Power Princess is Zarda Shelton. She has had a few different prominent versions throughout the years. There's kind of a few different alternate versions of her in the Marvel Universe, but in general, her story tends to involve her being a princess who hails from Utopia Island. Don't really think I even need to say much more. I mean, just look at her. She's definitely inspired by Princess Diana for sure. Zarda even has her own Steve Trevor in the form of Howard Shelton, who of course she ends up settling down with. He ends up running into Zarda after the boat he is on is shipwrecked. He tells her of the outside world as he is an American soldier and currently serving in World War II. Enough said. I think so. Number 1. Winter Soldier. Okay, so before you jump all over me for this one, I acknowledge that Jason Todd's appearance as Red Hood happened after Bucky Barnes returned as Winter Soldier, but I would also like to tell you the intended story behind Hush. The story that Jeff Loeb and Jim Lee had been building for issues that in issue number 617 of Batman saw Hush revealed as Jason Todd. Dun dun dun! This was actually Loeb's initial plan for this story. He'd been working towards that ending for some time, but there was an issue with it. He went online and he noticed that all the fans were guessing, and correctly so, that the reveal for Hush would give us Jason Todd, returning Todd to life after years of being dead. Loeb was basically disappointed that so many fans were able to anticipate the story's ending, and so he decided at the last minute to basically change it. In the finale, we learned that despite Hush being revealed as Jason Todd previously, this was actually Clayface disguising himself as Jason, not as part of his own plot, but as part of the true Hush's plot. And who is the true Hush? Well, I'm sure you know that. Thomas Elliot, Batman's old childhood friend. Yeah, so in other words, DC really came up with the idea of the return of a long dead character and heroic sidekick who then is twisted and turned evil first, but they just chose to change it at the last second. In fact, when Jason did inevitably end up returning as the Red Hood, he re-retconned his appearance in Hush to being somewhat legit, instead explaining that the one fighting Batman disguised as Hush, who was revealed to be Jason, was actually him, but then Jason had basically simply swapped out with Clayface, all in order to, I don't know, I guess mess with Batman? Oh boy. Yeah, I'm pretty sure Jeff Loeb later was like, maybe I should have just stuck with that. Oops.
Coming in at number 10 is Professor X. Amanda talked in the first video about how the X-Men were a potential knockoff of the Doom Patrol with the whole use of the Marvel method. But given that information, I'm gonna hone in on one character in particular who makes it even more of a knockoff from DC. The parallels between specific characters of the Doom Patrol and the X-Men is never more blatant than with Professor X and Niles Calder, who appeared within just 1 month of one another. July and June of 1963 respectively. Two paraplegic wheelchair-riding individuals who use not only their large amounts of money but also their incredible minds to create, run, and lead superhero teams composed of outcasts and vagabonds. Neither one of them really engages in the actual fights, at least very rarely do they ever, and they are both fairly shady people. The main differences come in the form of abilities. Xavier is a telepath, and an incredibly capable one at that, whereas Niles is just really intelligent. Also, Niles is a ginger and Xavier is bald, so they both suffer in the hair department. Kidding, gingers are cool. Gingers are cool.
Number 9. Thor. I mean, this is kind of a funny one to have on here since Thor is actually a knockoff on both sides, as he originated first, of course, in Norse mythology, so who's really to say who ripped off who? And because he is from myth and religion, he is therefore a character that is not owned by anyone in particular, which is why we can have so many Thors in the world. So of course both sides had their own interpretation of this hero. However, the fact of the matter is that DC actually got there first, even though throughout the years Marvel's version of Thor has definitely become way more popular. So when you think of Thor, the superhero, you usually think of Marvel before you think of DC. If you even think of the DC version at all. That's not a snub, it's a fact. The DC version is generally depicted as being a lot more dim-witted than his Marvel counterpart, that is definitely for sure. A lot more of a brute, which means that sometimes he isn't quite as clean-cut heroic as the Marvel version is. But some also believe the DC version to be a lot more true to the actual Thor of Norse mythology, so that's a point for him.
Number 8. Doctor Strange. Both DC and Marvel have threats that come in the form of mystical, magical villains, demons, and monsters that the regular old boring superheroes just aren't equipped to fight. Because of that, in both DC and Marvel comics, Earth is protected mainly by one dude who calls himself Doctor and has a fancy schmancy cape. But one of them came first, and sorry Doctor Strange fans, it wasn't him. DC's Dr. Fate first appeared all the way back in 1940, while Kent Nelson had has some magical ability, his main source of power, which is the case for all those who become Dr. Fate, is the Helmet of Fate, which contains the spirit of a cosmic entity called Naboo. Naboo essentially acts through whoever is wearing the helmet, but for Doctor Strange, who debuted in 1963, he does all by his lonesome. Strange trained and learned and became the Sorcerer Supreme all of his own volition, and while he does source magical energies from powerful entities like the Vishanti, he got to where he got all on his own. Does that make him better? That's for you to decide, but it won't change the fact that he is a bit of a knockoff of another magic-wielding sorcerer from DC Comics.
Number 7. Moon Knight. Many people have made the comparison between Moon Knight and Batman before, and although when you really dive into the character of Moon Knight, I do feel like the two are really different, from a surface level perspective, I can see why. Moon Knight, I would even say, has given me some straight up Azrael vibes before, and Azrael is literally both a wannabe Batman and like an actual version of Batman at one point. So Moon Knight is a superhero who sometimes is seen as not even being superpowered per se, but more of like an agent of justice who simply works really hard at his skills and acts as an agent of Khonshu, the Egyptian god of the moon. This is where the two characters really diverge with that whole kind of Egyptian god thing, but it's also implied through his missions that Moon Knight's god may perhaps not exist at all. Depending on the story you are reading, Mark Spector's god can either be interpreted as either another persona residing within him as a result of his dissociative identity disorder, or as a real supernatural force that guides, protects, helps, and sometimes even imbues Mark with power. Add in the fact that Mark Spector has another persona known as Stephen Grant, who is known for being a millionaire with his own butler, and who helps to outfit Moon Knight and his other detective persona Mr. Knight on their missions. And yeah, I mean, I see it, I get it. Also, Batman dresses all in black and Moon Knight dresses all in white, which, while a completely different vibe, different shades, does feel like an homage to the Dark Detective.
Number 6. Vision. In August of 1968, a mad supervillain creates an incredibly powerful super android who has a cool cape with an extremely large collar in order to destroy a group of superheroes, but because of comic books, the android becomes self-aware and thankfully good, and instead joins the superhero team. Am I talking about the Vision? Or am I talking about Red Tornado? It's a mystery. If we ignore the fact that the Vision was first introduced as an alien even before this, which I am, and we ignore the differences of intangibility and Red Tornado's wind powers, then it's very obvious that one of these characters are borrowing from another. And because of the title of this video, and to create drama in the comments below, I'm gonna say it's Vision. This is gonna be spicy. Ha.
Number 5. Captain Marvel. Captain Marvel was and has been quite the hot button issue ever since, well, any other character who could be compared to Superman existed. The interesting thing about this one is that the initial controversy was between not even Marvel and DC, but DC and Fawcett, where DC had felt that Fawcett's Captain Marvel was a blatant ripoff of their character. DC even at one point sued Fawcett and almost won that lawsuit. In fact, they did manage to prove that Captain Marvel was indeed a copy of their Superman, but what they failed to prove, and what lost them this case, was that Superman was theirs and theirs alone. Now that had to do with an error DC made in terms of making sure that each Superman comic had the proper copyright symbol attached. Ugh, that must have been embarrassing. As a result, they lost the case, but would eventually come to own Captain Marvel anyways. Then there was the issue of who should get to use that name, DC or Marvel. Marvel won that legal dispute, but the fact remains that their Captain Marvel first appeared in the 60s, while DC's, originally from Fawcett of course, appeared with his original publisher way back in the 1940s.
Number 4. Hawkeye. Hey look! A superhero who isn't actually super at all, who wields a bow as his main shtick, doing cool tricks and flips, and keeping up with the biggest team in their universe full of extremely powerful super beings and having shaky love lives. It's Green Arrow! Hawkeye! Sorry. How could I get them mixed up? Silly me. Now, there are inherent differences between these two characters that do set them apart from one another. For starters, Green Arrow is a bit more like Batman, being a billionaire, and he's incredibly extroverted, sarcastic, and opinionated, whereas Hawkeye is more like the everyman, a modest man who initially used his dark mercenary past to start off as a villain and eventually become a hero. Also, Hawkeye wears purple, where Green Arrow wears green. Now, it may not be entirely a fact that Hawkeye is ripped off from Green Arrow, but he did appear after the bow-wielding DC character, with Clinton Barton debuting in 1964 and Oliver Queen debuting in July 1958. Also, Clinton as a first name is odd. Sorry to my Clintons out there. but it's alright.
Number 3. Squadron Supreme. Squadron Supreme is intended to be a knockoff, or, well, a commentary. But in doing so, you become a knockoff, so this one shouldn't even be that triggering for me to claim. Although, let's be real, us comic book fans, we're pretty easily triggered by things, so I'm sure someone out there, amidst the, big Squadron Supreme fans, are there a lot of them? I don't know, might still be offended by me stating this. Even though it was intentional, it seems, on Marvel's part, and is pretty blatantly obvious. But hey, if you want to be offended, that's your prerogative. They don't try to hide this. It's all sort of part of a commentary on how DC's Justice League stack up to Marvel's own premier roster. So Squadron Supreme are kind of like a stand-in for them so that Marvel can be like, look, see, we're great, Avengers, woo! Hence why the Squadron Supreme and the Avengers so often have clashed in the comics. The Squadron Supreme of Earth 712, there have been a few iterations of this team, first appeared back in the 1970s in Avengers issue number 85, and definitely resembled DC's Justice League, with each character on the team seemingly filling in for a specific hero on the JL roster. In comparison, the Justice League first formed in the 1960s in Brave and the Bold issue number 28, so yeah.
And at number 2, Thanos. It's almost obvious. In fact, it is obvious, and according to the creator of Thanos, Jim Starlin, the physical similarities between the most threatening alien warlords in DC and Marvel Comics is intentional. It is well known that during the development of Thanos as a character, Marvel took clear inspiration from Darkseid. And why wouldn't they? Both Thanos and Darkseid come into comics seeking out MacGuffins that will give them unrivaled power in their respective universes. The Infinity Gauntlet, which would allow Thanos to spread death over the cosmos to impress the love of his life, Lady Death, and the anti-life equation, which would give Darkseid control over all life. But the characters obviously have some clear differences, which have mainly come over time with the progression of their characters, where Darkseid is just an evil conqueror, Thanos is a bit more of a complex character whose goals are strictly personal. What I think would be interesting is if these two fought. It has happened before, but there was never a clear-cut winner. I like Thanos more, but I do think Darkseid would whoop the purple-chinned Mad Titan. What do you guys think?
Number 1. Whizzer. Whizzer is a character who has been many different people throughout the years, but mainly we're talking about the character's first incarnation here, since it was so close to another character from DC who came into existence and was quite similar. Yep, you may have guessed it just from taking a look at the Whizzer. We are indeed talking about DC's Flash. Flash made his first appearance in Flash issue number 1 in 1940. Like Whizzer, there have been many iterations of the Flash as well. The version of the character we are talking about here is the Flash, Jay Garrick. The Whizzer, on the other hand, made his first appearance shortly after, appearing in August of 1941 in Marvel's USA Comics issue number 1, just over a year and a half after the Flash appeared on the comic scene. The original Whizzer that appeared was Robert Frank, and he not only boasted of similar powers to the Flash, possessing an intense super speed known as hyperspeed, and a body that could exist and thrive at high speeds, but he even had a similar look, with his costume also possessing little wings on both sides of the hood of his outfit. It's pretty, Jay Garrick's wings, Number 10, Cyberforce. Cyberforce has to be one of the biggest ripoffs of the X-Men that I've ever seen. They also are likely inspired by X-Force though, based on their team dynamic and their team name, so a little bit of like an X-Men X-Force. I would say both those things kind of come together here. Cyberforce was a group of mutants who also ended up captured by cyber data. Almost all, if not literally all of the team members, bear extremely strong resemblances to the X-Men mutants, which contributed to the series getting some serious flack in terms of it being kind of a copycat of Marvel's X-Men. However, it did differ in regards to some key elements. While X-Men was more targeted towards being family friendly, as many of Marvel's comics generally have been throughout the years, well except for maybe lines like Max, and to an extent I would say Ultimate, Cyberforce did not shy away from pushing the boundaries of, let's say, teen-related content, and this also got them some flack among certain circles when it came to critiques of the series and the team as well. Cyberforce is a team and series that originated at Image Comics in partnership with Malibu Comics. The team was created by Mark Silvestri and would eventually move over to Top Cow Productions, which is actually his own publisher, so yeah, Cyberforce. And friends, if you love what we do here on Top 10 Nerd and you love when we talk about things that are mutant adjacent, mutant related, or just mutants in general, be sure to let us know by clicking that subscribe button. Number 9, Ripclaw. I wonder who that could be a ripoff of. If you guessed another very famous Marvel superhero mutant with claws that is known by the code name of Wolverine, you'd be right, bub. Ripclaw was one of the few members of the team to actually withstand the test of time, being one of the most famous and long-lasting even after Cyberforce began to fade. Despite his team losing prominence, Ripclaw would end up continuing to guest star, showing up in other series like Sylvester's The Darkness. He's also had his own short solo series as well for a bit. Ripclaw differs from Wolverine slightly in the fact that he has ties to the native peoples of America, with it being believed he may belong originally to the Apache tribe, although he also seems to have ties to the Navajo, the Lakota Sioux, and the Cheyenne as well. Like Wolverine, he also has experience and a background in the martial arts as well. Ripclaw possesses cybernetic claw enhancements that are similar to Marvel's Deathstrike. They're actually claws that are part of his fingernails, allowing his fingernails to extend and become razor sharp. In addition to that, he also has superhuman senses, strength, and a healing factor. Number 8. Wildcats. Wildcats is a team created by Jim Lee and Brandon Choi for Image Comics, during a period when many creators were actually working with Image because they sought to own their own properties and ideas, which the big two were pretty opposed to at that time, and I mean, honestly still are today. Wildcats actually became so popular that despite the fact that DC did not want to let creators like Jim Lee own their creations and believed that it was actually the brand and staple characters that sold comics, not the creators behind said characters and narratives, they would later approach Lee to offer a sum for ownership of the Wildcats and his Wildstorm universe, so that DC could take over the publishing of both. Wow. When it comes to this team, it's easy to see the influence of Marvel's X-Men, just even when we look at its creator, Jim Lee's history. Lee is also known for his amazing art, and despite being now heavily integrated with DC Comics, is also no stranger to Marvel, having been one of the people behind one of the most famous and iconic runs, the 90s X-Men run, which featured art by Jim Lee throughout. In Wildcats, we follow a team of superpowered beings, known as half-breeds, who are the result of aliens coming to Earth, known as the Cherubim, and mating with humans. The conflict of the comic pits the Cherubim and their offspring against the Daemonites, another alien race they have been warring with for centuries. Number 7. Grifter. Cole Cash has some distinct differences, but also a lot of distinct similarities, I would say, at the same time, to another very famous and prominent X-Man that you are likely familiar with. Gambit. Grifter is Cole Cash, a literal grifter in terms of his backstory and origin from a young age. Not only does he have a history as a con man, but while having a shady past, he also appears to genuinely want to save and help people he deems innocent. Sort of like a thief with a heart of gold. Sound like, anyone you already know? Grifter has had psionic powers in the past, but is also known for his skills as a marksman, generally wielding 2 guns or using throwing weapons in combat. So yeah, he might not have the exact power set of Gambit, he doesn't like throw cards and they explode, but the whole, throwing things element of his abilities definitely seems to fit the bill otherwise. And I mean, I feel like even his look is very Gambit-esque. Number 6. Umbrella Academy. The Umbrella Academy was definitely influenced and inspired by other similar teams that came before, like the X-Men, there's no doubt there. But there are also elements of Hellboy in there as well, which is pretty cool, especially with how oddball the comic series, its characters, and the show inspired by the comics can be. Umbrella Academy and its creation, however, was also influenced by Gerard Way's experience with the band My Chemical Romance, and his time on tour. For those of you that don't know, Gerard Way is the person that created the Umbrella Academy, so fun facts. In fact, many of the Hargreaves are actually inspired by his bandmates themselves, who of course quickly become like your family when you spend so much time together with them and, especially when you're on tour. The Umbrella Academy is the story of a group of superpowered individuals who were adopted by Sir Reginald Hargreaves after their mysterious births, which all happened on the same day all over the world. Reginald recruited them to create his own superhero team, raising them and training them to hone their skills and master them over time. However, his plan was only met with, I would say, a modicum of success, and eventually the Umbrella Academy would disband. However, years later, they would come together again after the possibly mysterious death of their adoptive father and would be forced to reunite in order to prevent the end of the world. Number 5. Allison Hargreaves. Allison Hargreaves is maybe one of the most original feeling ripoffs that I've listed here in terms of, individual characters we're talking about, but still, she does seem to take a lot of inspiration from one very prominent X-Men character, Jean Grey. As a child, I would say Allison especially resembles Jean in the comics, with her hair appearing red as opposed to her standard purple role that we're used to seeing her have when she's an adult. And with purple hair, you could use that to link her to another famous telepathic or psionic character, Psylocke, aka Betsy Braddock, and also aka Quanon, depending on what we're talking about, and even if they're combined, that's a whole thing. Sometimes separate, sometimes tragically combined, I would say. Allison Hargreaves is known by the codename of Rumor. This is because she can use her powers to influence the will of others by using the phrase, "I heard a rumor." While Jean and Psylocke don't typically use their powers in this way, Jean is definitely capable of controlling people and influencing them in their minds using her own abilities, and I would also say so is Psylocke to perhaps a lesser extent, but still is a thing that she could do. Although her psionic abilities tend to be more used in direct combat, where she can deal mental damage using psi weapons, because that's what Psylocke likes to do. Number 4. Next Men. The Next Men definitely were inspired by the X-Men. There's no doubt about that in my mind at all. They were a creation of John Byrne for Dark Horse Comics, and of course John Byrne is also a writer who has a history of, being tied to the X-Men as well. These superpowered beings were more anti-heroes than straight-up heroes who attempt to rescue a world that they really don't know a lot about, having been raised in a virtual reality world inside a lab. In other words, they kind of, to me, share some similarities to our friend Phantom X. The Next Men also have some other interesting elements when it comes to how they were presented in contrast to the X-Men. Byrne tried to ground them and their abilities a little bit more in reality by making pretty much every superpower that they have come with some kind of quirk or some kind of setback in some way, trying to acknowledge some of the real world consequences one might actually have to deal with physically or mentally as a result of having superpowers. Because usually when you have superpowers, it's like you have super strength and it's not a problem for your body, but then there are other characters that have super strength in other worlds where it's like, okay, they're super strong, but they're not super durable, which seems like how powers would probably go, and then you just mess yourself up by using your super strength. Number 3. Nathan. Nathan of the Next Men is definitely a ripoff of Cyclops, but something that I think is actually really interesting is he isn't a direct one-for-one copy. His powers are actually, in a way, kind of like the opposite of Scott's, or at least an alternative, if not, the direct opposite to Scott's powers. They're not really the direct opposite, but they work in a very different way, but something that kind of feels like the opposite. Let me explain. While Nathan can also be spotted wearing shades with even a similar hairstyle, I'd say to Scott's, his powers allow him to see everything extremely well. Instead of expelling optic blasts from his eyes are more like great receptors for light, meaning that he can see things most people can't. Nathan, like Scott though, is also known for being the team leader of the Next Men, so yeah, they definitely are meant to be kind of like parallels of each other, but I do like that Byrne decided to give us a very different kind of eye-related mutation here. Also, this power set kind of makes me think of Eye-Boy, who I don't think was created yet when X-Men first appeared. I'm pretty sure they appeared in the 90s or the 80s. Eye-Boy didn't come out until the 2000s, so it is possible that Nathan, who was definitely inspired by Psyche, may have also influenced the creation of other X-Men like Eye-Boy, who appeared over at Marvel after Nathan's first appearance in X-Men over at Dark Horse, which is pretty neat actually. Number 2. G-Men. Before we even get X-Men in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, we're probably likely going to get X-Men copycats in the streaming series universe based off of Garth Ennis's The Boys. The G-Men are a villainous team inspired by the X-Men, who are another group of kind of Vought-endorsed heroes. At least I think they're Vought-endorsed. I haven't read all of The Boys, so I apologize if I'm incorrect about that one. And unsurprisingly, it's also believed that they'll be linked to Payback when they arrive in the live-action series of its own universe. Payback, for those who may not be aware, are basically The Boys' version of Marvel's Avengers in the comics, with their leader being a parody-inspired version of Captain America there, known as Soldier Boy, although they kind of went a different way with it a little bit in the live-action series. G-Men are led by John Godolkin, whose team were all kidnapped when they were younger and raised and trained by him in his own school. The name G-Men likely comes from his last name, Godolkin, but can also be a slang term used with negative connotation to indicate those working for the government. G-Men, government men. So that name kind of has a double meaning, and also it just basically means, yeah, they're not very good people. Surprise, surprise. Number 1. John Godolkin. If you thought Professor X was bad, wait till you meet his boys equivalent, which of course is way worse. The founder of the G-Men and its other spin-off teams is John Godolkin. In The Boys, Godolkin has done a lot of awful things to his superpowered students. Many of them I cannot even mention on YouTube because they're just that bad and kind of goes against TOS. Unlike Charles Xavier though, Godolkin has no powers to speak of, being more similar to Niles Calder, I would say, from DC in that regard, who is in essence the head of their version of an off-kilter outcast hero team known as the Doom Patrol. Doom Patrol, in fact, is not a ripoff of the X-Men, if you're wondering why I didn't list them here, as their existence actually predates the X-Men by a few months in terms of the comic's release. Godolkin ended up capturing his team members as opposed to offering them a place at his school, taking them kinda against their will. He specifically, however, seeks out runaways and orphans, which, to be honest, so kind of does Charles. So, although some of Xavier's students do admittedly come from happy, healthy families that simply basically chose to admit their children to his school to be trained in the use of their powers. So I would say, you know, that could be a difference.
Number 10. Miles Morales. In Marvel's infamous Ultimate Universe, when the original Spider-Man, Peter Parker, was killed by his universe's Sinister Six, the entire city of New York mourned the young hero, with practically half the city showing up to his funeral. Even though they had called him a menace for most of his short career, he was finally embraced as a hero and treated with the respect he deserved by both the city and the heroes who had looked down on him due to his age. So, when a new Spider-Man showed up in Ultimate Fallout number 4, both the villains and the heroes he came across were kinda weirded out and took the time to tell him that dressing as the recently dead hero was in terrible taste. Miles Morales of course became a fan favorite character and was eventually transferred to the main 616 Marvel universe, but it's interesting that until he was able to prove himself in story, many of the other characters thought of him as a disrespectful knockoff. Of course, now he is considered by characters and fans alike more as an official franchisee, having the approval of the original Spider-Man. Number 9. Scorpion. When J. Jonah Jameson hired a private investigator named Mac Gargan to follow Peter Parker to find out how he got such incredible photos of Spider-Man, Peter was able to easily avoid him thanks to his spider sense. Frustrated at how Spider-Man was beginning to be embraced by the public, JJ decided to create a bug-themed superperson of his own. He hired a scientist who specialized in mutating animals and paid Gargan $10,000 to undergo experiments that would give him scorpion powers. He also had a scorpion-themed costume made up, complete with a dangerous tail for Mac to wear, and then he sent him after Spider-Man. The experiment unfortunately drove Mac insane, and he became a supervillain, but the fact that he was created to essentially be a Jameson-approved version of the webbed wall crawler is an interesting bit of backstory. Number 8. Deadpool. Deadpool is actually more of a Deathstroke ripoff than he is a Spider-Man one. Deathstroke is a super deadly assassin named Slade Wilson who uses a combination of firearms and swords to defeat his enemies, and Deadpool is a super deadly assassin named Wade Wilson who uses a combination of firearms and swords to defeat his enemies. Sure, Deadpool is quippy in a way that's not dissimilar to the webbed wall crawler, but the aspect we're focusing on is his look. Deadpool wears a distinctive red bodysuit with white eyes and honestly doesn't look that much like Spider-Man. However, it is enough of a passing resemblance that it has become a running gag in the comics for characters to mistake Deadpool for Spidey. This is usually done to be a blow to Deadpool's confidence and sense of identity, and even more often as a joke where Deadpool does something absolutely horrible, inadvertently getting the crime pinned on Spider-Man, further damaging his notoriously constantly tarnished reputation. Okay, that's the last of the characters who ever cross paths with Spider-Man. Let's move on to the characters that borrow from the character a bit more liberally, with most of them copying either his look, his powers, his bug theme, or the revolutionary teenage Superman aspect that Spider-Man started. Number 7. Sailor Moon. Before Spider-Man, the common thought process among writers was that teenagers could not be superheroes, only sidekicks. That's part of what made Spider-Man so revolutionary, as in the early comics, comics, we got to see him balancing his high school life with the responsibilities of being a hero. It was such an iconic element that even though Spider-Man was actually only in high school for the first 28 issues of his series, he is still mostly thought of as a teenage superhero. This element was used for lots of heroes across different media, but let's go with Sailor Moon, so we can dip our toes in the manga world for a bit. Usagi Tsukino was a regular high school girl before she met a talking black cat named Luna, who told her that she was really one of the Sailor Senshi of love and justice, Sailor Moon. She spends a lot of her run having to balance the typical issues of teenagehood, like school and romance, with saving the world from evil beings. Not one of the most obvious imitators of old Webhead, but it's a fun example of him having an influence beyond just a Western audience. Number 6. Batman Beyond. When the Batman animated series came to an end, its creators followed it up with another banger called The New Batman Adventures, which continued the adventures of the great Kevin Conroy's Batman while introducing the other members of the Bat family. It was extremely well received, but the network made the surprising choice to cancel it after one season. Their reasoning was that shows featuring teenagers such as Buffy the Vampire Slayer were doing really well, and they wanted a new Batman show featuring a teenage Batman to try and capture some of that audience. Not wanting to mess with their established continuity, the producers pitched the idea of the series taking place in the future, with Bruce Wayne passing down the mantle. They got the green light from the network, but none of the writers really wanted to do the show until they realized that it would allow them to, quote, do all that Spider-Man stuff, with the tortured hero trying to balance their life as a superhero with their personal and school life. This idea got them excited, and the resulting show, featuring Terry McGinnis becoming the new Dark Knight, was a worthy and iconic addition to the Batman mythos, receiving 3 full seasons as well as a feature film, before eventually being incorporated into the comic books. Due to the talents of all those involved, Batman Beyond is able to stand on his own 2 feet as a hero, but it's interesting that it was the influence not of the original Batman, but of Spider-Man that got the writers started. Number 5. Sideways. Sideways is a DC Comics character who was caught in an earthquake when Challenger's Mountain came back from the dark multiverse. He fell into a chasm in the ground and through a rift, which led to the dark multiverse. This gave him the ability to teleport through dimensions, as well as super strength, agility, and reflexes. Like Spider-Man, he is a teenage hero trying to balance the various aspects of his life, but the more significant influence is clearly his costume, with the mouthless mask and shape of the large eyes. As Bully Maguire put it in Spider-Man 3, it looks very, similar. Number 4. Bug. Next up, we have our first Spider-Man inspired villain of the list. Bug is a little known DC villain who operates out of Gotham City, having his first major appearance in Batman Family number 3. Bug is a villain who specializes in surveillance, using a special suit that allows him to stick to walls. The mask is very Spider-Man-esque, and the whole sticking to walls thing while operating with a bug theme makes Spidey's influence pretty obvious. Although this character is way less known than the Marvel original, and seems more like a off-brand dollar store action figure your grandma would buy you by mistake. Number 3. Haunt. When Secret Agent Kurt Kilgore was killed by rival agents, his spirit sought out his brother, a flawed and bitter priest named Daniel, in order to try and protect his newly widowed wife from the agents who had taken his life. When the agents attacked Daniel, Kurt's ghost merged with him and Daniel became Haunt, a brutal and violent superhero with razor-sharp claws, super strength, and speed, as well as the ability to manipulate his ghostly ectoplasm, forming it into weapons, cobwebs, and tentacles. Haunt was created by superstar comic book creators Todd McFarlane and Robert Kirkman, and is a part of the Spawn universe featured in Image Comics. While story-wise and personality-wise, Haunt is very different from Spider-Man, his costume and tendency to be drawn surrounded by cobwebs makes me think Todd McFarlane missed drawing Spider-Man when he created him. Number 2. Dragonfly. Transitioning away from characters who are influenced by or simply copies of Spidey, let's talk about one that's straight up parody. During that weird period in the 2000s when we were constantly getting spoof films like Scary Movie, Epic Movie, and Meet the Spartans. One of the better entries in the series was Superhero Movie. It made fun of superhero movies from the early 2000s like the X-Men trilogy, Fantastic Four, and Batman Begins, but its main source of inspiration was clearly the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, with its lead character, Rick, being bitten by a genetically enhanced super dragonfly and becoming a bug-themed superhero. The movie is borrowing heavily from the visual style of the Raimi films and lifts several moments almost directly from the first Spider-Man movie with a comedic twist, such as Rick getting a job taking photos of the dragonfly, having his identity discovered at a Thanksgiving dinner by the villain, and tragically losing his uncle, who is played by Leslie Nielsen of Naked Gun and Airplane fame. Like most of the parody films of the era, it wasn't well received when it came out, and a lot of the jokes haven't aged well, but the film is definitely at its best when it's riffing on the classic elements of the Spider-Man story rather than making pop culture references that have aged like a fine milk. Number 1. Black Spider. Eric Needham was an addict who accidentally killed his dad while robbing a liquor store. He felt remorse for this and began hunting down and killing the various dealers in Gotham City. A wealthy benefactor gave him an advanced costume and weapons to help him in his goal, but it turned out to be a rival criminal just trying to get rid of his competition. Black Spider's lethal approach brought him into conflict with Batman, and after being defeated, Black Spider began teaming up with criminals, being more interested in revenge against the Dark Knight than fighting crime anymore. The character obviously has a similar costume, and choosing to make a character in comic books spider-themed is begging for comparisons to Spider-Man, but his knockoff status was pushed to the limit when he was introduced in the Young Justice animated series, where he was full-on web-slinging and being voiced by the spectacular Spider-Man voice actor Josh Keaton.
And at number 10 is Popclaw. The boys' television show and the comics that inspired it are filled with characters that are meant to stand in for more well-known and beloved superheroes in an effort to tell a story about what superpowered beings might be like in the real world. Homelander is obviously meant to be Superman. The Deep is clearly a play on Aquaman, and Queen Maeve is very much Wonder Woman. One of the more minor characters to appear in both the comics and the TV show is Popclaw. Popclaw is a woman whose name is rather self-explanatory. She has claws that pop out of her arms with which she attacks her enemies. She's less one-to-one with Wolverine than other characters in the franchise are with their heroes that inspired them, but the influence is clearly there in aesthetic if nothing else. More comic-savvy fans will probably say she is more similar to X-23, and the creator of the character, Gareth Ennis, has said that she is actually inspired more by Scandal Savage, but for the more casual viewer of the TV show, the first thought that will pop in their mind when they see Popclaw and her powers will be, oh, it's Wolverine. So for that reason, she will get the number 10 slot on this list. But in at number 9 is Seahawk. This character from Image Comics is really Mark Barrows, who was hunting for underwater artifacts with his family when one of the artifacts blew up, resulting in his father's death, but him and his brother being granted superpowers and becoming the heroes Seahawk and Cold Snap. He would go on to join the superhero team The Brigade, and overall isn't that much of a Wolverine knockoff. However, the fact that one of the powers granted to him was accelerated healing, and the fact that his look is kinda Logan-esque with the fangs and the pointy-eared mask makes me think that Wolverine was at least an influence on the character, and makes me comfortable putting him on the low end of this list. Number 8. Warblade. Warblade is an often forgot character that was created by Jim Lee and Brandon Choi for the DC Comics Wildstorm universe. Similar to what happened with Wolverine, Warblade was kidnapped and brainwashed so that he would be a member of an elite strike team known as the SHOC before breaking free of their control and joining a super team known as the Wildcats. Unlike Wolverine, he is not human and instead a Karen, an alien race who can shapeshift into a mercury-like substance. He can use this metal morphing ability to create claws, which he of course uses to attack his enemies. He is also a world-class martial artist with ties to Japan, but though he is clearly inspired by Wolverine, he is different enough to rank pretty low on this list as well. Number 7. Lobo. Lobo is a really interesting character as he was originally created as a joke. He was meant to be a parody of the gritty anti-heroes who were becoming so popular in the 90s by being a ridiculously buff, space bounty hunter who would say goofy tough stuff and was just meant to be a big old goofy joke. One of the characters who was a main source of inspiration, according to one of its creators, Roger Slipher, was Wolverine, with his tendency to drink beer, constantly talk about how edgy and tough he was, and always talking about how he was the best there is at what he does. And what he does isn't very nice. Lobo also has a powerful healing factor, but that's neither here nor there. What the creators at DC Comics didn't anticipate was that the readers wouldn't take the character as a joke and would genuinely love the main man. Not once to look a gift horse in the mouth, DC quickly expanded the character to give him his own identity and gave him his own series of books. Number 6. Wild Child. First appearing in Alpha Flight number 1, Wild Child was created by John Byrne to be little more than a Wolverine-like character. Like Wolverine and Sabretooth, who isn't on this list as he was created to be a foil to Wolverine as opposed to a copy, Kyle Gibney has an animalistic nature as well as a healing factor and razor-sharp claws. Due to his freakish appearance, he was shunned by humanity until he was found by Department H, who made him a member of the Alpha Flight training program, Gamma Flight. When Alpha Flight had its funding pulled by the government and went independent, members of Beta and Gamma Flight were recruited by the evil Jerome Jackson to be members of the evil Omega Flight, who tried to defeat Alpha on 2 separate occasions in John Byrne's original run on the comics. When John Byrne left the book to work on the Incredible Hulk series, Wild Child was just a Wolverine-esque villain who had never really been an issue for the Alphas to defeat, but he was further developed by subsequent writers to be a more unique character, eventually joining the hero team and becoming Weapon Omega and dating fellow teammate Aurora. His morality has shifted quite a bit over the years, with him being a member of the Hellions, X-Factor, Weapon X, and becoming a good foil for Wolverine to fight rather than a throwaway copy he was originally intended to be. Number 5. Killraiser. Honestly, I feel like the motto of Image Comics in the 90s for the most part was, what if we took this character and then made them extreme? I mean, Spawn is undeniably cool and original as a character, but a lot of the characters sometimes feel like everything that was whack about comics in the 90s and turned to 11. Look at Killraiser for instance. He is a mute character who has sharp claws that come out of his gauntlets that he uses to fight and brutally tear to shreds his enemies, but then they took it the extra mile. This is how I think the pitch meeting went for this character. Dude, what if Wolverine had more claws? You mean, dude, like claws that come out of his feet as well? Nah, dude. What if Wolverine was just claws? Dude, what do you mean? I mean, what if he was mute so we never had to develop him as a character, and instead of being a dude that just has claws, he was just a dude made of claws, coming out of every part of his body? Dude, that's awesome. Number 4. Pantha. In one of the more brazen acts of copying the editor of New Titans in the 90s, Jonathan Tierson wanted to make the Titans more like the X-Men. Rather than taking, say, the element of using a superhero story as a metaphor for prejudice or introducing the more convoluted relationships between characters of the universe to tell long, overarching stories, they decided to take this not literally and make some characters that were more like popular characters from the Marvel team, one of which was Rosabelle Mendez. Otherwise known as Pantha, or X-24, was a woman with cat-like abilities and claws who had a mysterious past she knew next to nothing about. She was subjected to experiments that granted her abilities, and she had to control her animal-like rage lest she lose control and scratch up everyone around her. Beyond that, the blue and yellow bodysuit with a yellow animal-like mask makes Pantha a pretty clear Wolverine ripoff. Of course, with the designation X-24, you might be forgiven for assuming she was a ripoff of Marvel's Laura Kinney, otherwise known as X-23. But Pantha does actually predate her by over a decade, with Pantha first appearing in the early 1991 and X-23 first appearing in late 2003. Number 3. Wolveroach. Cerebus was a comic book series that starred an aardvark named Cerebus, who works as a barbarian. The series was originally intended to be a parody of Marvel's take on the Conan the Barbarian series, but over time became an odd hodgepodge of experimental explorations of religion, gender, and politics. It had a large cast of characters, many of whom were clear parodies of iconic superheroes, but one of the more egregious ones was the Cockroach, who over the course of the story took on various superhero identities such as Moon Roach, Punisher Roach. However, the one that got the most attention was Wolveroach. As you can see, he was basically just Wolverine. The character's role in the story was to be a character who had an almost religious fervor about him, intended to parody the oversaturation of Wolverine in the comics at the time. As As Dave Sim put it himself in an interview for Comics Journal in 1996, when it came time to do a Roach character that had the ambience of religious fervor surrounding him, it had to be Wolverine. The fact that Marvel got so upset about me putting Wolverine on the successive covers, it's not a parody, you are now stealing the central icon of our church. Well, there you go, yes, I picked the right one. I didn't realize I was going to be putting my foot in this badly. I thought parody's parody, but you can take the chalice they called Captain America and do a parody of that. You can take the subaltern and do Moon Knight, but by God, don't you touch our Wolverine. That's the center of our church. As you can tell, Dave had very strong feelings about how popular Wolverine was and seems to also be kind of a weird dude. Number 2, Ripclaw. Cyberforce was originally intended to be a spin-off series of X-Men and X-Force, before eventually ending up at Image Comics rather than Marvel. It makes sense that a few of the characters would bear some similarities to members of the various mutant teams. The character that clearly riffs on Wolverine is Ripclaw. Actually, a good rule of thumb, if a character has the word claw in his name, there's a 70% chance that they are a Wolverine knockoff, as you can tell from all the other parts on this list. Ripclaw got his abilities after the spirits of his ancestors left him the mystical power to take on animal-like abilities, which is nice for him. I mean, all I got from my ancestors was the ability to burn in the sun and a history of heart disease. Ripclaw was then captured by the evil Cyberdata Corporation, who brainwashed him and gave him cybernetic enhancements such as razor-sharp claws. He has a tendency to snap into an animal-like rage, and he has also got a healing factor. Wolverine. He's basically Wolverine. But in at number 1 is Deadlock. Another Image Comics character, John Locke was an ordinary lowlife until he had a heart attack and died. He was taken to the shady science group known as Project Born Again, who discovered that he had a latent mutant gene, and they resurrected him, driving him completely insane in the process. He went on a rampage before being eventually taken out and resurrected again and assigned to be a member of the superhero team Bloodstrike. Just by looking at him, the Wolverine influence is pretty clear, with the fangs, the claws, and the mask that is exactly like Wolverine's, just a different color. It always baffles me when characters that are this similar to the characters they are ripping off of are created. Like, yeah, Wolverine was huge in the 90s, but if you create a character that is this similar, don't you realize that most people are just gonna be like, man, I'd rather just go buy a Wolverine comic?
Number 10, Bronze Tiger and Black Panther. Okay, so these characters just barely qualify for this list, as most of the similarities between the two are purely superficial. The Black Panther is the ruler of the fictional African nation of Wakanda and uses his heightened abilities given to him by the heart-shaped herb to dress up as a panther to protect his people and the world. Bronze Tiger grew up stateside in Central City and killed a burglar when he was 10. He realized he really liked doing that and traveled the world, learning martial arts, balancing his chi, and eventually becoming a good guy. The main similarities are that they are both black men who dress up as jungle cats to fight their enemies, but I think knockoff would be too strong of a word. Maybe loosely inspired. Either way, Black Panther first appeared in 1966, and Bronze Tiger didn't show up until nearly a decade later in 1975. You could also make the case that Bronze Tiger is really more similar in character, at least, to Iron Fist, who first showed up in 1974 due to the character's martial arts backgrounds and passion for finding their chi. Number 9, Bug and Spider-Man. Next up, we have our first Spider-Man inspired character of the list. Bug is a little-known DC Comics villain who operates out of Gotham City, having his first major appearance in Batman Family number 3. Bug is a villain who specializes in surveillance, using a special suit that allows him to stick to walls. The mask is very Spider-Man-esque, and the whole sticking to walls thing while operating with a bug theme makes Spidey's influence pretty obvious. Although this character is way less known than the Marvel original, and seems almost more like an off-brand dollar store action figure that your grandmother would buy you by mistake. Number 8, Deathstroke and Taskmaster. This one was actually actually suggested by one of our commenters on part 1, and I kinda see it. Both Deathstroke and Taskmaster were highly gifted and efficient soldiers, with Taskmaster working for S.H.I.E.L.D. and Deathstroke working for the US Army. They both excelled in their field work and married women that they were paired up with for work. Both of them also tried to heighten their already impressive abilities with experimental procedures, with Taskmaster using a modified version of the super soldier serum, and Deathstroke undergoing a procedure that allowed him to use more of his brain while heightening his strength, agility, and durability to near superhuman levels. Both of them then left government employment and became mercenaries and assassins. There is a lot in common about the two, and they were both actually created by George Perez. So even if the resemblance wasn't intentional, the water was certainly being drawn from the same well. Taskmaster first appeared in February 1980, with Deathstroke appearing a little under a year later in December 1980, making Taskmaster the original. But given how much money Marvel has made by ripping off Deathstroke for Deadpool, I'd say they're more than even. Number 7. Rocket Red and Iron Man. This is another that is mostly about general vibe and aesthetics. Iron Man is of course billionaire Tony Stark, who has created his own robot suit of armor to protect Earth. He first appeared in 1962, and due to his many years in the comics and the new levels of fame his appearances in the MCU brought him, he has since become one of the most recognized and beloved superheroes in fiction. On the other hand, DC tried their hand at the red robot armor hero in 1987 with Rocket Red, a Russian named Dmitry Pushkin, who uses a suit with very similar capabilities as the Iron Man suit to fight alongside the Justice League International. Obviously, the communist and the billionaire tech giant aren't very similar personality-wise, and Red Rocket didn't build his own suit, but I'm listing them more for the similar gimmick than for the characters themselves. Number 6. Lobo and Wolverine. Lobo is a really interesting character, as he was originally created as a joke. He was meant to be a parody of the gritty anti-heroes who were becoming so popular in the 90s by being a ridiculously buff space bounty hunter who would say goofy tough guy stuff, and was just meant to be a joke. One of the characters who was a main source of inspiration, according to one of his creators, Roger Slifer, was Wolverine, with his tendency to drink beer, constantly talk about how edgy and tough he was, and always saying how he was the best there is at what he does, and what he does isn't very nice. Lobo also has a powerful healing factor, but that's neither here nor there. What the creators at DC Comics didn't anticipate was that readers wouldn't take the character as a joke and would genuinely grow to love the main man. Not ones to look a gift horse in the mouth, DC quickly expanded the character to give him his own identity and gave him his own series of books. Number 5. Killer Croc and the Lizard. This is kind of a weird one because I don't think it started out as a ripoff. The Lizard is really Kurt Connors, a scientist who transformed into a giant green lizard after testing a serum designed to help grow back lost limbs on himself. He first appeared in 1963, but has gotten more violent and savage in subsequent appearances. A similar DC character is Waylon Jones, aka Killer Croc. Looking at more recent versions of the character, you'd think this would be obvious, but it's a tiny bit more nuanced than that. In Croc's first appearance in 1983's Detective Comics number 523, he is much less reptilian than he would eventually become. He simply has a skin condition that gives him a vaguely gray and scaly appearance. However, over time, he gradually became almost a completely different character, changing to green and becoming more and more reptilian with each appearance until he became much more similar to the Lizard. As it is now, both characters are giant green reptiles who fight their hero in the sewers and feed on unsuspecting prey. But the Lizard came first, and Croc only became more of a knockoff as time went by. Number 4. Black Spider and Spider-Man. Eric Needham was an addict who accidentally killed his dad while robbing a liquor store. He felt remorse for this and began hunting down and murdering the various dealers in Gotham City. A wealthy benefactor gave him an advanced costume and weapons to help him in his goal, but but it turned out to be a rival criminal just trying to get rid of his competition. His lethal approach brought him into conflict with Batman, and after being defeated, Black Spider began teaming up with criminals, being more interested in revenge against the Dark Knight than fighting crime anymore. The character obviously has a similar costume, and choosing to make a character in comics Spider-themed is just begging for comparisons to Spider-Man. But his knockoff status was pushed to the limit when he was introduced in the Young Justice animated series, where he was full-on web-slinging and being voiced by spectacular Spider-Man voice actor Josh Keaton. Number 3. Imperiex Prime and Galactus. Galactus is a classic Marvel character who first appeared in Fantastic Four number 48 in 1965. Known as the Destroyer of Worlds, he is a colossal cosmic being who wanders the universe destroying planets, which he then eats to survive. You would think he was a pretty unique character, and he was, until a new DC villain named Imperiex Prime was introduced in Superman Volume 2, number 153 in the year 2000. Imperiex is also known as the Destroyer of Galaxies, and is a colossal cosmic being who is the embodiment of entropy. He wanders galaxies, destroying planets in order to get closer to his goal of destroying the universe so that a new one can be created. Their goals are slightly different, but for the most part, these characters are very similar, with Galactus clearly being the main source of inspiration for the relatively obscure Superman villain. Number 2. Panther and Wolverine. In one of the more brazen acts of copying, the editor of New Titans in the 90s, Jonathan Peterson, wanted to make the Titans more like the X-Men. Rather than taking, say, the element of using a superhero story as a metaphor for prejudice, or introducing the more convoluted relationships between members of the universe to tell long, overarching stories, they decided to take this note literally and make some characters that were more like popular characters from the Marvel team, one of which was Rosabelle Mendez. Mendez, otherwise known as Panther, or X-24, was a woman with cat-like abilities in claws who had a mysterious past she knew next to nothing about. She was subjected to experiments that granted her her abilities, and she had to control her animal-like rage, lest she lose control and scratch up everyone around her. Beyond that, the blue and yellow bodysuit with a yellow animal-like mask makes Panther a pretty clear Wolverine knockoff. Of course, with the designation X-24, you might be forgiven for assuming that she was a ripoff of Marvel's Laura Kinney, otherwise known as X-23. But Panther does actually predate her by over a decade, with Panther first appearing in early 1991 and X-23 first appearing in late 2003. Number 1. Batman Beyond and Spider-Man. When the Batman animated series came to an end, its creators followed it up with another banger called The New Batman Adventures, which continued on the adventures of the great Kevin Conroy's Batman while introducing the other members of the Bat family. It was extremely well received, but the network made the surprising choice to cancel it after one season. Their reasoning was that shows featuring teenagers, such as Buffy the Vampire Slayer, were doing really well, and they wanted a new Batman show featuring a teenage Batman to try and capture some of that audience. Not wanting to mess with their established continuity, the producers pitched the idea of a series taking place in the future, with Bruce Wayne passing down the mantle. They got the green light, but none of the writers really wanted to do the show until they realized that it would allow them to, quote, do all that Spider-Man stuff, with the tortured hero trying to balance their life as a superhero with their personal and school life. This idea got them excited, and the resulting show featuring Terry McGinnis becoming the new Dark Knight was a worthy and iconic addition to the Batman mythos, receiving 3 full seasons as well as a feature film, Return of the Joker. Due to the talents of all those involved, Batman Beyond is able to stand on his own 2 feet as a hero, but it's interesting that it was the influence not of the original Batman, but of Spider-Man that got the writers started.